Now, the fight against corruption in South Africa has been going on for years. Lord Peter Hain, an anti-apartheid activist and former UK cabinet minister, has been at the forefront of this fight. He has delivered a public lecture hosted by UCT's summer school outlining his role in exposing global complicity in state capture. Reporter Ayesha Ismail attended this event and joins us now. A very good afternoon to you, Ayesha. Lord Peter Hain is someone who's never really held back on his thoughts of corruption and malfeasance in governments, and we've seen with UK companies he's been vocal, has led to a lot of change in institutions. Tell us a little bit about the lecture and some of the highlights that stood out for you.
Well, what he told his audience this morning was that the values behind fighting state corruption is nothing different from fighting apartheid 50 years ago, and he's called on South Africans to continue that fight. And as we know, that his lecture centered around global complicity in state capture as well as looting of billions of rand. This is what he had to say about that.
Blame for the infamous Zupta state capture decade is mainly focused upon a corrupt president and his cronies. But both South African and global businesses were culpable too. It took and still takes two to tango. SARS would not have been disabled without Bain and Company infamously and unlawfully carrying out President Zuma's personal instructions at 17 one-to-one meetings with him in his private residence, not even his office where there would have been an official record. Nor could the Guptas have money laundered billions out of the country without global banks like HSBC, Standard Chartered and Bank of Baroda enabling them to do so. And that sorry story continues to this day, with ministers and local councillors still wanting backhanders to dispense procurement contracts, to grant licenses, and so on, to companies eager for the work and willing to pay. It's high time, I believe, that the business community owned up and ostracized anybody still playing that game. Because if that happened, the corrupt politicians and their officials would have their looting massively curbed.
Ayesha, he also spoke about the fact that South Africa needs to change its trajectory in terms of dealing with issues of this nature, and saying that a lot of work is going to need to be put in to make sure that we see that kind of change. Maybe just elaborate on his thoughts on that for us.
So a lot of the questions that people asked him, and of course he speaks from the perspective of an anti-apartheid campaigner, people were asking him about whether South Africa can be fixed, whether it is possible and how it can be fixed. And he responded to them by saying, you're going to have to do the fixing and the changing. He's saying that South Africans can no longer sit back and watch and fold their arms and see this rot unfolding in front of their eyes. He says, just like during apartheid, they're going to have to rise up, stand together to stop South Africa from becoming a failed state. This is what he had to say.
You won't change this country unless you do it yourselves. Politicians won't do it for you. They become too comfortable in power, too dependent on its privileges. They have a vested interest not to change, some of them. Once politicians start looting, it becomes an addiction. They become political alcoholics, political drug addicts. They can't and they won't stop doing it. You, the people of South Africa, are once again to rise up and resist as civil society, firmly standing together and saying enough is enough, to reclaim the democracy and the ideals of the freedom struggle, to kick out corrupt politicians and their officials, and be careful not to replace them with the even more corrupt and authoritarian populists, whether from right or left, within and outside the ANC, who claim dishonestly that they're fighting for a radical form of economic transformation for themselves, not for everyone. Beware also of those hankering after old white privilege.
Now, that was reporter Ayesha Ismail. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon and breaking down some of the key highlights of that lecture delivered by Lord Peter Hain.